Welcome to Mormon Land, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
Before we start, here's a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com where you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, podcast transcripts, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. In 2012, scholar John Turner published an award-winning biography of Brigham Young, a mountain of a man in Western Americana. But there remained a bigger fish to pursue, namely Joseph Smith, the, quote, white whale of Mormon history, the religious icon who gave birth to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Turner's voyage is now complete, and the resulting book, Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, is available this month. Infused with the latest scholarship, the volume reveals a brother Joseph who is sometimes playful, sometimes reckless, sometimes incensed, often inspired, but always enterprising and forever fascinating. The book appears certain to go down as the most significant and up-to-date biography of the Mormon founder since Richard Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling. Turner, professor of religious studies and history at George Mason University, joins us today in studio to discuss what he discovered about Joseph Smith, the husband, the father, the book publisher, the community organizer, the city builder, the religious innovator, the polygamist, the visionary, and above all, the prophet to millions of followers. John, welcome.
Thanks, David. Peggy, good to be on and in Mormon Land.
Great. Okay, so I referenced this. You've written extensive biographies now about kind of the two monumental men atop Mount Rushmore of Mormonism. Whom did you find more interesting and or difficult to depict, Joseph Smith or Brigham Young?
That is a great question. Well, I would just say they're differently challenging to write about. So you called Brigham Young a mountain of a man. He's a mountain of archival sources. I mean, it's just a overwhelming number of documents to transcribe and search through and decipher and interpret. With Joseph Smith, it's a much smaller corpus of material. It's a little bit more well-worn. But I would say maybe more challenging because for some key moments of his life, we don't have the sources we might want to have. And there's sort of a border between history and matters of faith and belief that I didn't have to engage as directly when I wrote about Brigham Young. For Brigham Young, I mean, he was a true believer in Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon and in the doctrines that Joseph Smith advanced. With Joseph, you're starting at the beginning, so you can't set aside some pivotal foundational questions. So it was differently challenging. They were both incredibly, incredibly fun to write about. Their huge personalities and just diverse range of activities. These are fun biographical figures.
So your book is called, The Rise and Fall. That might raise some eyebrows. What about the fall part?
Yeah. So, in the book description, I note, his rise from, this impoverished farmhand in Western New York to his fall at the hands of a murderous mob.
Oh, that's what you mean.
That's what I mean. Just to be clear, rise and fall is not meant to imply that he became God's prophet and then became a fallen prophet. That's not the implication. I surmise some people might, at first glance, look at the subtitle and think that, but I'm not making that argument.
So in the intro, you say some writers see Joseph as a prophet, others as a scoundrel, but you see him as a bit of both. Which parts of him do you see in which category?
So that's fun. That's a fun question. So when I say that I see him as a prophet, as someone who's not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I'm not coming at Joseph Smith with the question of, is he God's prophet for the last dispensation or not? I'm I'm taking that label rather differently. I mean, he had a clear self-conception as a prophet. The Book of Mormon refers to a choice seer, which is a clear reference to Joseph Smith in my mind. And by publishing the Book of Mormon, I argue that he really fulfilled that prophecy, and was a prophet and seer. He brought forth revelations. He generated texts that his followers understood as scripture. He introduced rituals that bound his followers to each other and to God. So, I mean, very much, career description, prophet, absolutely. Scoundrel is probably that's kind of a tough word. What I mean there is, at several moments of his life, I think he behaved in ways that were less admirable. Part of that is an argument about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon itself, which I do think, did involve some subterfuge in addition to some literary inspiration. I also think, perhaps I'm also most critical of Joseph when it comes to his introduction and practice of plural marriage in the early 1840s during the last several years of his life. So I'm basically trying to say with that sentence, there's some things I really admire about Joseph Smith and some things that I don't admire as much. I think he's a complex man in terms of character and purpose.
So I'm going to stick in the intro for just a little bit, but we'll get deeper into the book. You state matter-of-factly that you wouldn't trust him with your money, your wife, or your daughter. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, the last two are things I really value a lot, so I really guard them rather closely. So, yeah. So I'll just take the sort of two parts of that. Money. I don't think that Joseph Smith was a scoundrel in terms of defrauding people of their money or stealing their money. I think people who consecrated their wealth to the church, they did so because they believed in its mission and they got a lot out of it. But Joseph was terrible with money. Brigham Young commented in sermons, once he was in Utah, that when it came to financial matters, Joseph's judgment was not very sound. That just wasn't his thing. If you wouldn't want Joseph to manage the financial aspect of your enterprise, he, at several points in his life, he accrued a tremendous amount of debt, and then found himself subject to lawsuits and a fair amount of strife because of that. So that's what I meant with that comment. Actually, he was also really charitable in terms of money. He was known for being very hospitable and charitable when newcomers would show up in Kirtland or Nauvoo. He might give them things, and he was often running merchandising operations, and money-wise, that's not a great way to run those operations. So the second part of that is I wouldn't trust him with my wife or my daughter. That's because he proposed plural marriage to the wives of several of his associates and also some other already married church members. Brigham Young even had recorded this dream in his journal, in which he sees Joseph and his wife, Brigham's wife, riding in a carriage together, which I interpret, I'm nervous about that. So I guess before 1841, I might have trusted Joseph Smith with my wife and daughter, but after 1841, not so much.
Okay, so what's new in this book? Obviously, Joseph Smith papers have come out since Bushman's book, but we've written a lot about all this. What is new? What did you discover? What surprised you?
Yeah.
Tell our listeners.
Now, Joseph Smith is a pretty well-known figure in these parts, right? Absolutely. So first, let me just say something about the Joseph Smith Papers Project. It's not so much that there is a large corpus of previously unknown material that was accessible to me. Some things were released and published in recent years, such as the Council of 50 Minutes. Also had access to the William Clayton Journal, which previously hasn't been accessible, although it's more or less been available in published form. The true value, in my opinion, of the Joseph Smith Papers Project is the Church History Department has done such an impeccable job of transcribing, but then also annotating those documents. They've done so much to excavate every little detail of every known detail of Joseph's life. So I would just say it made my life a lot easier. But you're right. I mean, for the most part, Joseph's life is rather well documented and has been for a couple of decades. Richard Bushman had tremendous access to church resources. One thing that I think is new, a little bit new and different in my approach, is I want Joseph's mirth, recklessness, love of adventure, and drama and danger to come through in my biography. So I purposefully didn't write an absolutely long and ponderous biography. Joseph's life moved. He was always moving in new directions with tremendous energy, often plunging into controversy or deep water, as he sometimes called it. And so I wanted to capture that. His life is well documented enough that you could spend 1,000 pages narrating it. But I wanted it to move along as Joseph's own tragically short life did.
Yeah. So let's turn to a pivotal moment, of course, and we've already referenced it a little bit. What makes you conclude that, to your best sense, Joseph did not have gold plates? And why did you feel compelled to tell your readers your opinion on that?
Yeah. Well, I thought it's an important question. And I think, in some ways it's a metaphysical question, I suppose, but in other ways it seemed to me a question that was within the purview of a historian or a biographer. And, sometimes when you get to those sticky wickets, you might choose to set them aside or simply report what Joseph claimed and maybe report what his detractors claimed and sort of leave it at that. But I thought I sort of just felt a responsibility to say what I thought, to give my conclusion. And I think my conclusion rests on two things. Number one, Joseph kept some sort of object hidden, didn't show it to anybody in an ordinary way. So a starting point for me is, in a situation like that, subterfuge and deception seem more probable than actual golden plates. But then secondly, there's the published Book of Mormon itself. I actually rather like the Book of Mormon. There are passages in it that I find lovely, that I find inspirational, that I find dramatic. As a Protestant Christian, there are also parts of the Book of Mormon that really resonate with me in a Christocentric sense, but I don't understand it as an ancient record. And if you conclude that the Book of Mormon is not an ancient record, but a 19th century creation, then it makes a lot more sense to think that it flowed out of Joseph Smith's literary mind rather than had a basis in actual golden plates. So that's how I approached it.
At one point, later in the book, you refer to it as a novel, which
Correct.
Some Latter-day Saints would go,
Well, honestly, that sentence that you're thinking of was a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, because I think I refer to Joseph Smith as a writer who had a surprise niche hit but could never get the second book done, because he had these other big plans, the Bible translation and then the Book of Abraham, and those ended up being a bit attenuated. So he never undertook a second literary project that became as expansive and lengthy as the Book of Mormon.
Mormon Land will be right back.
So we'll get to the playfulness. Because the Smith family lived in poverty much of their lives, how might Joseph's playfulness and desperation for money have played into what you could say about the ruse about the gold plates? Do you think that had something to do with it?
Well, I do think it had something to do with it. And I would say, as a money-making scheme, it was a terrible idea. But I've already said I didn't think he was really good with money, right? I mean, if you are a mostly uneducated, at least in a formal sense, individual in 1827, 1828, and your family is totally down on its luck. They've lost title to their farm. They don't really have an economic path forward. And if your best idea is to try to find a way to publish a 600-page book and sell it for a pretty high list price by 1830 standards, that's a bad way to try to make money. But I do think that was part of Joseph's thinking. He's concerned about book sales. He wants to make sure that Martin Harris doesn't end up with too much money from the book sales vis-a-vis him. He also undertakes an attempt to sell the Book of Mormon's copyright in Canada. So I think money's part of it. But just to be clear, I would absolutely not reduce this to a harebrained money-making scheme. Joseph absolutely had a religious and ecclesiastical vision and also an epic story to tell. And referring to it as a ruse or subterfuge, for me, he had to have some way of getting that vision into circulation. And I don't see, if there's an element of deception to it in terms of the plates, I don't see that as some mendacious act. I just see this as just a stunning accomplishment, an amazingly audacious idea that he pulls off. And it's really remarkable that he's able to pull that off. And so I find at least as much to admire. I find more to admire in the story than to criticize.
I mean, he was involved in like treasure hunting, digging, or whatever. And if he can get people to believe he found gold plates, I mean, would that possibly get more clients for that kind of work?
Sure. And I think it could have. And, perhaps just on the basis of his reputation as a seer, as someone who could find treasure or other buried objects in the earth, if you wanted to come up with a reasonable next step, it might have been, move to Ohio or move somewhere else and organize a treasure hunting expedition and make more than, $14 a month that I think he makes when he's working for Josiah Stoll. But he doesn't do that, right? He goes off in this entirely new and much more ambitious, bold direction. And so I find that that's just an interesting point of departure. A plan didn't work out, so let's try something much grander, which I think is very characteristic of Joseph's life.
Right. On the move all the time, as you say. Yeah. So we've talked about this a little bit already, but I want to dig a little deeper. After publishing the Book of Mormon, as I read the book, it just seemed that he spent much of the rest of his life trying to surpass that work or at least match it. But he never was able to recapture that, quote, magic, it seems. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think that is a fair assessment. I mean, he definitely started other textual projects, the Bible translation, Book of Abraham. He's interested in this forged set of plates known as the Kinderhook plates briefly in the early 1840s. But he always sets those aside. He doesn't stick with them. Actually, I don't see that so much as a failure on Joseph's part, but a reflection of the capaciousness of his mind and activities. The simplest thing, again, would have been, well, let's write another big book, Book of Mormon Part 2, right? Something like that. But he doesn't do that. As I say in the book, he's not a one-trick prophet. He does all these other things. So, he never really has time to set aside 3 to 6 months to do another big book.
Well, by that time, he's got a church, too, and a community, right?
He's got a lot going on.
Right.
So you mentioned Joseph's recklessness and that he enjoyed living dangerously, especially regarding polygamy. Can you give some examples of that?
Sure. So in terms of enjoying the thrill and the danger, I'm gonna back way up and say that I see this at a lot of points in Joseph's life, and I think oftentimes, partly because it's connected to debates about, is Joseph a true prophet? Is this the true church? Discussions about Joseph Smith tend to become really serious. And there's a lot of serious parts of his life. But if we lean too far into that, I think we obscure some other things. So treasure hunting, for instance. Joseph's 20 years old. He's out in the woods at night with other young men looking for treasure. Torches. I mean, that could be fun, right? I think he had fun doing that. And people approach that as, a really, maybe scandalous part of his life. I think he's 20 years old. That's kind of fun, right? Going to Pennsylvania, going to different parts of New York State. I could see enjoyment there, right? Some of those stories about what happens right after Joseph gets the plates, where he's dodging enemies in the woods, he's running through the woods at night. I'm not saying those weren't harrowing. He even comes back injured after one such run. I think he kind of enjoyed that too. He comments that he'd feel almost out of sorts if he were out of danger. He loves adventure. I quite positive that when he wasn't getting too upset with some of the other Zion's camp marchers, he loved that sort of thing. Being on the road for days at a time, sleeping rough, that was no problem for him. Dodging sheriffs and other lawmen in the early 1840s. Okay, that's definitely harrowing, but I think he enjoyed those escapades. There's that scene of Joseph when he's under arrest in a hotel in Palestine Grove, Illinois, and somebody's knocking at the door and somebody's threatening to shoot him, and he rips his shirt open and he just yells, "Go ahead and shoot me." I mean, this is a larger than life guy, and I think he can enjoy those moments. So, plural marriage, Peggy, that was your question. I think he could enjoy that as well. It was clandestine. He's sneaking in and out of town sometimes. He's meeting, outside in a hidden location with a plural wife to be wearing a disguise. There's an element of adventure and thrill in that as well. And he pursues plural marriage very recklessly during those several years. It's a large number of sealings in a short period of time, including at times where there's a lot of public controversy about it and potential for danger. And really until Emma is able to largely put the brakes on the practice after the summer of 1843, he's a bundle of polygamous activity.
Let's talk about Emma now. Was she the love of his life, and was he the love of hers? How did their relationship also evolve?
That's a great question. And, one of my lasting regrets is that we don't have a greater window into Emma's experience of many of these things. So she's there, for instance, when Joseph comes back when they go get the plates at night, she's there. Mm-hmm. Well, what's she experiencing? I'd love to know. They go through a tremendous amount of heartache together. They lose several children, babies at birth or shortly afterwards. During the first 5 years of their marriage, they lose an adopted son. They lose another young son early in the 1840s. Emma goes through a lot. They're moving around a lot. She's pregnant often under difficult circumstances. And I think it is a relationship that obviously has its ups and downs. And then there's this tremendous conflict over polygamy in 1843. The remarkable thing to me is that in late 1843 and into 1844, the last half year of Joseph's life, they seem to have transcended some of that conflict or set it aside. And there are some recorded, moments, I think, of genuine warmth in journals during those months, of warm conversations between the two of them. So no matter what else we would want to say about their relationship, there was an enduring warmth and commitment.
Okay. So some of his followers saw Joseph's reported revelations as manipulative and self-serving, and others viewed them as inspired. What do you think?
So Revelations, one of the things I say at the outset is, I do weigh in on some things in the book, such as Joseph's visionary experiences and then the question of the plates. When he dictates messages in the words of Jesus Christ, what are we to make of that? Sort of makes me think the medium is the message, sort of. That's a good example of that. And so so what are we to make of that? Does Joseph sincerely believe that every revelation he dictates is a divine message? What elements of his own personality and decision-making are there? Is that 100%? Is it some combination? I think that's a hard thing to weigh in on. So, for instance, there's this city council meeting in, I think, 1842. And during the meeting, Joseph just scribbles a little revelation and tosses it to a man named Hiram Kimball, basically warning him not to oppose him. Well, that seems a little contrived, right? But who knows? Maybe Joseph sincerely thought that was God's message for Hiram Kimball at the time. We don't know. I think it's really hard to assess the sincerity of other individuals that we might sit in the same room with in our own lives. We don't always get that right. It's really hard for historians to go back almost 200 years and make definitive judgments about the amount of Joseph's sincerity in every given situation.
It does seem like when he's saying things like, my daughter Emma should do this, you're like, that's kind of a interesting way to order your wife around.
That's a really interesting way to resolve things, right?
Yeah.
God said.
I will say, it's interesting that there is that one revelation to Emma,
right,
which both of them seem to have regarded as significant quite a few years later in the context of the establishment of the Relief Society.
Right.
But as far as we know, Joseph did not govern his household with revelations all the time.
Did he ever try to tell, because I don't remember seeing this in the book, did he ever try to explain the reason he didn't inform Emma about polygamy more? Because God told him not to tell Emma?
So,
did he ever say that to people?
I don't think we know, right? I think we surmise that he doesn't tell Emma because he knows that Emma would intensely disapprove. And in fact, right, when I think Hiram says, well, let's bring a revelation to Emma, Joseph doesn't think this is a good idea. He says, you don't know Emma as well as I do. Right. Why try that? And of course, she didn't like it at all. I think, it's so heartbreaking, I think, to read about the way he does introduce the subject to Emma, because he doesn't really come clean, or he comes clean part way, right? He tells her about this divine principle. She apparently has such faith in her husband's prophetic leadership that she on some level agrees and recommends a number of young women in the household as individuals who might be sealed to Joseph. She doesn't know he's already been sealed to them in marriage. She also doesn't seem to have grasped that these sealings are going to be consummated. And then she's really angry when at least some of them are shortly thereafter. And then in the summer of 1843, their relationship is extremely estranged and hostile and angry with each other. Publicly, she very much sticks with him. This is also when he's arrested in connection with old charges from Missouri. And publicly, she's very resolute in her support for him.
So let's talk bigger picture now with his followers. What was it about Joseph Smith that drew so many to follow him, despite maybe the many hardships or sacrifices they were sometimes endure or asked to make? And what, consequently, John, sometimes drove some away?
Well, a lot of things, David. That's a great question. And I think sometimes when we talk about the rougher points of Joseph's life or personality, inevitably you get that question. Well, why were people following this individual? Well, first of all, that kinetic energy and the grand ideas and the vision of a community with purpose and unity, those are all extremely attractive to people. I think also Joseph, more so than many religious leaders of his time, spoke to genuine anxieties of American Christians who weren't finding those anxieties addressed in other churches. So, which of the churches, if any, is true, right? Joseph and his family were not the only Americans who were struggling with that question. Well, Joseph provides a really clear answer, which is attractive, not to most Americans, but a subset of Americans fervently love his answer. Some other questions, some other anxieties. What about my loved ones who died without experiencing faith or baptism or this or that? Joseph, in Baptism for the Dead, has a really creative answer that church members embrace with tremendous enthusiasm. Other Americans mock it as, ridiculous idea, but church members aren't bothered by that. They immediately take to Baptism for the Dead. Sealing in marriage, which is connected to plural marriage and is therefore controversial, perhaps, but sealing in marriage also deeply spoke to the anxieties of church members. Am I going to be with my departed spouse again forever? And what happens if I remarry? What's going to be the situation?
Children she's lost, right?
Right. There are real theological, spiritual anxieties that Joseph's teachings address in really creative, meaningful, and ritualistic ways. Joseph had a real penchant, I think, for putting flesh on his teachings with rituals that made them real and powerful to his followers. Those are a few of the reasons. There are a lot of reasons why people followed Joseph Smith. Some of the same things push people away, right? There was always something else new. Joseph was never fixed. He's always in motion. And new ideas were often challenging. So new theological ideas, such as the vision of different heavenly kingdoms. Well, that was new and different. And then when Joseph gets to Nauvoo, there's a torrent, really, of new ideas and rituals. So followers who might have embraced the church and been extremely satisfied with Joseph's leadership at one point, several years later, Joseph might be going in new directions, and some of those church members didn't want to follow him to those new places.
Fascinating. So was destroying the Nauvoo Expositor and its press the biggest mistake Joseph made in leading up to his murder? Or was this kind of fate sealed already without even that?
That's a great question. So that's definitely the catalyst for the closing days of Joseph's life, in terms of having to go to Carthage to answer a charge of inciting a riot. That's what, along with his declaration of martial law, that's what leaves him vulnerable in a Carthage jail to the machinations of an anti-Mormon mob. But the walls have been closing in for quite some time. And as Nauvoo grew, it's sort of a reprise of what happened in Missouri. And there just wasn't room for a theocratic kingdom led by a biblical-style prophet in the United States of the 1830s and 1840s. And I think Joseph, during the last 6 months of his life, he's increasingly desperate and perhaps therefore a bit reckless in terms of how to respond to both this external political pressure and increased internal dissent, which is in part because of plural marriage. And so he's been in this bind. Some of his actions, the first half of the year, they make it worse. And then the expositor, his enemies know. I mean, they're not necessarily pleased he destroyed their newspaper, but they know he's made himself vulnerable.
Okay, if you could go back in time and personally witness one event in Joseph Smith's life, what would it be?
You're only going to give me one, David?
Okay, give me a couple then. I can think of a couple you'd probably be interested in, but go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think I'd have wanted to come along when he retrieved the plates, right?
We've already talked about at least, that, right?
You know? Yeah. And I could write a more solid account, right? An additional witness. I would have loved to have been at the Kirtland Temple during its dedication, and during those other services, foot washing, in which so many individuals were speaking and singing in tongues and seeing visions. I think that was quite a moment. It was really one of the high points in Joseph's life. So I would have liked to have been there for that as well. Sure, I would have wanted to have been a fly on the wall at a few other moments in the 1840s, but I think that late March, early April, 1836 in Kirtland, I think it would have been something to be there.
So the literary critic Harold Bloom called Joseph Smith an authentic religious genius who excelled in religion-making imagination. He's not talking about the literary quality of the Book of Mormon. He's talking about an imagination. You already kind of talked about. Do you agree with that? Does that capture some of why Joseph is so irresistible to biographers?
I think so. So you're right. Bloom didn't think much of the Book of Mormon or Joseph's other textual productions. He called them the stunted stepchildren of the Bible. I actually think they're a bit better than Bloom thought. But I do, I would say again, the range of Joseph's religion-making activity is really remarkable. So I already touched on ritual. I mean, several of the rituals that Joseph introduced, which were, new to American Christianity, new to Christianity in general, they proved of enduring power, right? And so it's one thing to throw out some genius level ideas, right, without creating a structure in which they can take shape and persist. So I see that as a big part of Joseph's genius. He also, I've talked about his recklessness and energy. He also, and this is a bit of a counterpoint, he also did have a desire for decorum and ecclesiastical order. Kind of went about it actually in a characteristically kinetic way and created all sorts of different layers of church government. But he wasn't just, sometimes people will say, well, Joseph was the revelator, Brigham was the organizer. They both did a lot of both, I think. And the fact that Joseph produced scripture, introduced rituals, introduced layers of church government, I would also say created an iconic story or founding myth. That canonical account of the first vision and Joseph's early experiences, that's a story that also over time shaped a people, not maybe as much during Joseph's own life, but so in terms of a religion maker, yes, absolutely. But it's not a single thing. It's, that whole package of what we could call prophetic activity.
You closed by writing that Brigham Young said he could never fully figure out Mormonism. After writing this book, how much closer are you to fully figuring out Joseph Smith?
100%, David.
No. Certainly closer.
No, closer. But I guess what I would say is, some people talk about writing books as a labor. It's a laborious thing. It's a lot of time to go to archives, a lot of different drafts. Joseph, he has this comment that words are sort of crooked to him, like language is hard. And I definitely think that's true. Writing about Joseph Smith was a tremendous amount of fun. So I'm pretty lucky.
One more question. Where do you stand on the daguerreotype?
Daguerreotype. Well, I guess I think no. I don't know. And, I've talked to people who think yes and talked to people who think no. And then I look at portraits and even wax seals and so forth and sketches of Joseph Smith during his life. And I look at that daguerreotype and I think doesn't fit for me. And I don't have any experience in the technical realm of thinking those things through, but that's just more my gut.
You've obviously chosen for the cover a pretty standard portrait.
Mm-hmm.
Did you think about using a picture, getting the rights to use a copy of that picture in the book someplace, or would that have...
I thought about it, sure. Mm-hmm. I think the thing is it still feels uncertain to me, and I hope that people might still pick up my book in 3 or 5 years. And maybe at that time, we will have gotten confirmation that, yes, that's definitely an image of Joseph. And maybe Yale will want to do a paperback with a new cover, and I would be down with that.
Or worse, they find out no, and it's in the book, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, people have included some things that turned out not to be trustworthy in other books, and everybody makes mistakes. I'm sure I made some, but I just wasn't sure about it and didn't want to run with it.
The name of the book, again, is Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet. John Turner, thanks for joining us. And thanks to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.